Yes, it's a wonderful pleasure to be here, and thank you to all that, largely my team, Polina still. Super cool to organize this event. I hope you will enjoy it a lot. Learn a lot about context, but also exchange across the board. I will try to be here for the talks and the posters also, so feel free to talk to me. I don't bite. And it's, yes, and that's what Max also indicated, or who was it? Like, it's a low key, right? It's not high, super formal or whatever. So also in this talk, raise your hand if you want to clarify something in the middle. I have a lot of slides, but I will mainly talk about the general idea of context and make you aware what context is, and then I will show actually Max's work mainly for context inference, modeling this on the low-level decision-making process, and then go on the social level and also say how on the social contextual level you exchange information. And if we have time, I would still show you some deep learning neural network stuff that forms the basis of this kind of, I believe, but probably we will not have time for that. So, but that's fine. But I will start essentially with context, as the word cloud was perfect because the word cloud put environment in the center, very big. And I want to ask basically, well, what is context really, and which context are we talking about? And so the environment popped up, so context is all around us, clearly. This produces a context to us, right? But I would argue that, at least from the cognitive side, right, the much more important part is that context is what we construct in our brain as well. Yeah? We don't, right, if you look at this room, we don't have the exact details of every individual here, of every little place of each of you or pair of each of you. And you can zoom into this individual local contexts in this room, extremely flexible with your mind. Yeah, you can broaden it and see, okay, it's a stage and we have a lecture hall and there are people scattered, right, and listening. But you can also go into your cell phone and suddenly are in your cell phone world briefly. Yeah, or you just try to listen to me and forget that context really and really think about what is he talking about context. So we have this extreme variety and complexity in our mind, and we can maneuver through many contexts. So the context really that is cognitively relevant is really is within us, right? We create the context really, not the environment offers contexts, but many. And our mind focuses on that context that is currently at stake, that's currently relevant for us somehow. And the mysterious thing is, of course, how this works. Now, and from Max's intro, I just copied the text here, right? So from the dictionary, yes, it says, rightfully, the circumstances that form the setting for an event, statement, or idea is the context, but I would argue this circumstances is offered from the outside. If we don't do mind wandering or something, then our context also drifts to something totally fictive. But we are selecting it to essentially fully understand what's currently going on, or try to fully understand what's currently going on. And I have, over the last few weeks, months, I have used this picture to illustrate this further, which is a fun little Wimmelbild in German, somewhat. So this scene, right, this cartoonish kind of scene, shows you, when you zoom out of it, right, it shows you like, okay, a countryside area with a lot of stuff going on, and if you just see it as a whole, right, the context is this whole countryside area and you don't know the details really. But then if you zoom into this individual situations that are depicted here, right? It's nearly impossible to maintain multiple sub-situations at once. Yeah? If you maneuver your head around, right? And I will illustrate this further if I give you like particular task-specific frames briefly, right? So for example, count the number of flying birds. Yeah? So basically then your context zooms into the air and searches the flying birds, right? And you might find those, and maybe you have broadened your context a little bit further. The air is also in front, and there's still a couple of bird stops. So this one, right, and this one also maybe you have noticed, right? But now you were in this flying context and this looking for birds kind of, right? And if I say, okay, look at the deer, then the deer are over there, and so there's a little deer family, right? And then you're in this deer, they stand around this tree, right, locally, and the rest goes away temporarily, right, while you're in this context. So you can zoom out again anytime if you want, right? And there's a lot of other options, right? You can look at the shepherd if you want, and can ask concrete things then, right? That would be fully impossible if you see the whole thing, right? But if you look at this particular thing, the sheep seem happy, the shepherd looks very content standing around there, right? So that's what you can do when you have the shepherd context, and I can also ask you, is there a black sheep also? And well, no, clearly not, right? And you would only look at this local situation. Right? So you zoom in and out of stuff. You can look at the pond, and I can ask you about the water lilies if you want, right? And then you're in the pond surface situation, and you have the context of that pond. Jogging, there's some people jogging, so you can talk about the joggers, actually 2 kids, right? Or photograph taken, right? If you zoom into this guy's here, right? You suddenly do a nice perspective taking task here as well, and can imagine how would the photograph look like that they are taking, right? And you need to zoom into this contextual frame there, right? And have this particular perspective that you can zoom into, and the rest is gone. Right? You cannot maintain everything. So, or walking the dog, yeah? And you could even do many more in here, right? So this, I hope, illustrates to you really consciously, accessibly, right, how the world offers context. Huh? But the context that we choose to think about or to maneuver and interact with at any point in time is done by our brains. Huh? And somehow that unfolds extremely seamlessly and interactively and with very little effort, surprisingly, as well, most of the time. So the question is really how is this happening? And I argue a little bit further now that, okay, a very important principle of context is, damn it, how did that happen? No? Okay, so here, very important thing is that active context inference essentially searches for this consistent scene-like perspectives onto something. And notice this doesn't need to be spatial necessarily and so forth, but I will show you now examples that are mainly spatial. But I think this consistency term, which maps directly to predictive coding and predictive networks that are attractors, basically, are consistent with each other. That is an extremely important thing because an inconsistent context is extremely difficult to maintain. Any story that is inconsistent is super annoying, for example. Or imagine the context of you sitting in the beer garden and you want a nice table in front of you, but the table is shaky the whole time. It's super annoying context, right? It's extremely nice once the table is made stable. You don't have to deal with the table anymore, and you can focus on the conversation because you have a contextual flat surface where you can put your drink and stuff, and everything's fine. So this consistency is seems to be extremely important. I can illustrate this nicely in this artistic photograph collect combination. I hope it's reasonably visible from the back, right? You see basically how our mind struggles to get an interpretive whole, basically, right? A consistent whole of this scene. And well, maybe we can do, who sees it's bent? It's bent, right? No? No? I always see it a little bit like that it's like this, right? The color is not so good today. Because here you see basically the sky. It's looking spherical somehow. It looks much nicer here on my slide. So these people look down, right? Whereas these people look up, and you see a walkway kind of going from here, right? So in order to make it consistent, your brain swaps either between two contexts, right? The one on top that look down and the one on the bottom that look up. Or to make it kind of consistent, you start bending this surface assignment in some way. Yeah. So there's spatial frames of reference, and one particular important thing is the axis of gravity, right? And it's extremely important to maintain two axes of gravity that point in different directions in the meantime. Because the fundamental property of context is that we have one axis of gravity, basically. Yeah. And if it doesn't quite align, then the brain desperately tries to find an alignment. Also, another nice one from Escher here is all these very typical Escher pictures, right? This is an early one that you might not have seen, right? You can either see the orange-brownish guys on the horse, right, or the grayish guys, but it's extremely difficult to see both of them. Why? Because your context contains a background-foreground separation, it seems, right? So there's like so either the one are in the foreground and the rest is projected in the background, and it's background that's irrelevant or basically fuzzy in your head, and so you only see one of those, right? Another context illustration is this one, also an Escher painting. Which I hope also not so nice to see, but you see the fish here, right? So if you see the fish underwater, your context is the subsurface area, basically. And it's extremely difficult, again, to maintain the pond's surface with the leaves on top, right? And the fish underwater in its three-dimensional subsurface within water space, basically. It's nearly impossible to maintain both. Either you navigate in the one or the other. And then like you can ask, well, is the fish content, what's he doing, and so forth. As I say, the light's not so perfect. But once you are on the leaves, right, you can count the leaves, which types of leaves are there, and so forth, then the fish is gone, basically. So, right, again, the environment offers many contexts. M.C. Escher called this three worlds, because you still have the third world are the trees with the shadows, but it's a little hard to see on that projection. So the trees, if you look at the trees and where they come the shadow, and imagine the trees standing at the back that creating the shadows, is again a different contextual frame of reference. So what I have showed you is this consistency and this primary structural components of context. Right, so context is something that sets up the stage, right? It sets up the frame of within which we are thinking, within which we are elaborating and observing our environment, right? Somehow very important are frames of reference and spatial outlines, affordances that are offered within the context and that are relevant in the context, foreground-background separation we saw live. There are relational schemas, right? The sheep herd, for example, was a nice relational structure, right? A group of entities that were well distributed and can be viewed as a whole, basically easily thus. The event schemas, like behaviors, like jogging, going on a walk, taking the dog out, and so forth. There are motivations involved, right? Why does the shepherd stand there and is content, has nothing really to do, but is happy that he has his sheep around, right? And so it's fine. You can only imagine this within that context of this intentionality also, and the goal of the shepherd, what's his duty and all this, right? If it's just another person, it's totally impossible, right? And all the concepts that are involved, right? So this is kind of the context, right? And then within that context, within this contextual schemata, we have these observations that I just described, basically. Then they are concrete, right? Then it's about this actual concrete situation, this particular shepherd with that herd, and that we can count the sheep and we can see there's no black sheep and so forth, right? So it's this, it sets the frame, right? It's the context is a frame kind of that our minds focuses on in the environment, and then it does reasoning, decision making, planning and so forth within these frames. And the mystery is, of course, how we seamlessly can choose these frames so extremely effectively that we, most of the time, 99 whatever % of the time, we don't overlook very important stuff that was in the way, right? If you get trapped on a corner or so, right, then the context wasn't quite broad enough, yeah, in a sense. Yeah, you missed an important part that was relevant for your behavior, but most of the time it's there, right? Which now makes us ask the question, right? Why is this contextualization so omnipresent in our minds, since it kind of gives a problem sometimes that the context might not chosen be right, and then when we hurt ourselves or even worse, or we don't find solutions to problems and so forth. So why this contextualization? And the argument that we have come up over the last years was also with Sarah, who's going to give a tutorial later, and is basically that this contextualization really saves energy. It essentially enables, and it saves energy and makes planning, reasoning, and interaction with the environment much more efficient when the context is set right. Why? Because within a context, right, imagine you're riding your bike or something, you have to be really fast, and there's suddenly some pedestrian and you have to decide how you move, right? You cannot elaborate on this in like detailed planning ways, right? You just have to do your habitual behaviors. Okay, now it's really getting dangerous, I brake, right? Or I can still circumvent and so forth, right? So it enables very much faster behavior because you're so focused on your context and you're not distracted by all these other things that you could think about. No? And meanwhile, it also enables more flexible behavior within that context, because if you do model-based planning, right, model-based reinforcement learning, model predictive control, name it how you like it, yeah, it's basically you have to throw out trees into the future of elaboration of what could happen next, and thus inform your decision by planning, by model-based planning. Yeah? And in order to do this, you have this problem, as we all know from anybody, I hope everybody knows, right? I mean, there's an exponentially growing tree, right? If you have, I mean, the more options you have to choose from, right? Take chess or Go, then it's then we are on 20 or even 100 or so, right? And per step. But if the step goes in the future and you have to consider all of them, right, you're exponential in this branching factor, and that then grows extremely fast. So you have to focus yourself, right? And this focus, I argue, is basically also about this contextualization. The contextualization focuses your mind on the particular things at hand, and also within that context, the habitual behaviors, your habits, how you interact with this context, streamlines your minds further within that contextual structure, essentially developing model-free behavioral policy structures out of within particular contextual frames of reference. So why the contextualization? From a cognitive science perspective, essentially is the frame problem, which Max has pointed out, right? So, and I put here a little quote, half quote. I adjusted a little bit from that Stanford encyclopedia. So basically, the frame problem. Well, actually, who has not heard about the frame problem ever? Okay, so but a few, yeah, that's fine. So right. So okay. So basically, the frame problem essentially states it comes from logic originally. And it basically was the realization that how can you represent in logic all effects, and how can you represent everything that is not affected and represent also everything that is affected and side affected by a particular interaction with the environment, and the realization that this basically, if you would represent all of this stuff all the time, you have a computational explosion that you cannot deal with at all. And so originally, this quote to most AI researchers, the frame problem is the challenge to represent the effects of an action in logic without the need to explicitly represent many intuitively obvious non-effects as well as irrelevant side effects, basically. Yeah. But if we go away a little bit from this computer science logic perspective, symbolic reasoning perspective, to many philosophers, the AI researcher's frame problem is suggestive to a much wider issue, or of wider issues. How to limit the scope of reasoning required to derive the consequences of an action. Right? Because in the end, every side effect can in principle be relevant somewhat, right? But you just mentioned to seamlessly just focus on that stuff that seems relevant. So more generally speaking, how are we able to make decisions on the basis only of what is relevant to an ongoing situation without having explicitly considered all that is not relevant? And this is kind of context inference. The answer is context inference, but how the heck does it work? Yeah? So the question is, how do we infer this frame, solving the frame problem, within which our current thoughts unfold? So I could also say the context and frame now is nearly synonymous here, right? This is our internal mental context that's setting the frame within which we think at any point in time. And it's amazing how we can do this. It's crazy, really. It's a mystery for sure. There's no clear answer so far, but it seems to be a fundamental process in our minds. And you find it in many, many disciplines that people talk about context, right? But nobody has really said it on this, okay, this seems to be a primary thing. We always set stuff in a context, and then we think within that context. No? Like we always have a focus on a particular sub-reality of our full, extremely complex reality, right? Putting it on a more formal level, you could say, for those that follow me now, like if you perceive the world outside here as a huge, super complex, partially observable Markov decision process, the context essentially sets a local, ideally controlled, local, observable Markov decision process, nearly approximating a Markov decision process within this extremely complex POM-DP. And that's what we have to solve this problem if we want to, well, if our mind has to solve this problem. And so it does it. If we want to go to AI, it also needs to solve this problem somehow. No? So the proposal is, right, as I said, we infer context for overcoming the ubiquitous frame problem. Context inference essentially enables us to implicitly ignore all stuff that is currently irrelevant and to focus on the stuff that is currently deemed relevant. Context inference thereby needs to be extremely fast and is thus probably somewhat directly invoked, right? Given our current needs and so forth, we focus on this stuff, on that stuff, and we maintain focus. We try to maintain focus while it seems interesting to us, right, or important to us. There is a need, so to be able to quickly and intuitively focus on task and situation relevant stuff. Notice the environment offers, right? It has basically the affordance characteristic to it, and of course ourselves, right, also are demanding in that sense, and they trigger tasks, right? I want to understand what this guy talks. I have a really dry mouth, need something to drink, blah blah blah, right? And that basically, yeah. Right? So you maneuver these needs that are internal and that are combined internal from your own needs and external from the environment that it offers. Of course, if you go to mind wandering or planning your next vacation or so, then it becomes fictive and the context is fully fictive, actually. So, and because of this, because this context sets the frame within which we think, the context inference essentially needs to encourage context stability but also fast context changes. It's like kind of seems to be an opposition here, but it's while we are in context, right? While we want to open the bottle and take a drink, right? So then I'm like partially doing a little parallel processing, right? But so I'm in the bottle context and taking a drink, right? So quenched my thirst, so right, and meanwhile. And while I had this bottle, and in this context, right, it was a little hard to do this in parallel, so my language was a little interrupted, right? Because I had these two contexts, you guys and the talk, right, and this bottle interaction, right? And I needed to keep the bottle interaction stable, right? Because if I would fully drop out of the context, I would just let the bottle fall or so, right? I mean, I would just spill the water or so if I couldn't maneuver the control task within the bottle context, right? And meanwhile, I was trying to control tasks to keep my train of thought and controlling the trains of thought and the communication that was going on, right? So that's why you need to have a process that maintains context stability, that I can think within the context and stay on my control task focus, basically, and all the attention unfolds within the context and so forth. But if I'm done, right, or if we leave this room, or if I hop on my bike, I need to swap contexts really seamlessly to basically be prepared for the next one. So we must have context predictors that can set contexts flexibly and adaptively, but also maintain the context while I'm within the context, such that I can maneuver my thoughts and plan and attention within these particular contexts that I have, right? Right, and there is evidence that this is going on in our minds from various sources. There is very new work that thalamocortical loops might be extremely important to maintain context and swap between contexts. But there's tons of loops there, and they might maintain subcontexts also and so forth. It's extremely important that the context is there to do planning and reasoning within a particular context that even allows us to do counterfactual reasoning then, for those that know about this, right? I mean, you couldn't do counterfactual reasoning if you wouldn't have a contextual frame where you have like, if I would have done this instead, right? Or if this would have happened instead, then the progression would have been a different way. I need to have an umbrella to maintain both alternatives basically in my head. And I would argue that this is, again, the context that is there, needs to be maintained stably, and alternatives need to be considered. So that's more or less the first part. There's some wide interdisciplinary evidence. Maybe I just show this. So from developmental psychology, you really see how kids, over the first 2 or 3 years, there are various results that show that they build up contextual schemas for particular stuff, and within the contextual schema, there's only particular little concepts that are maintained to really process a task, to succeed in a task in a particular contextual schema. There's lots of neuroscience evidence. I will not touch so much about the hippocampal prefrontal cortical loop, but it seems to be extremely important to maintain episodic structures within a particular context, and also probably extremely important to align local perspectives with global, world-centered, multiple world-centered perspectives. And the thalamocortical loop I mentioned already. And on the modeling side, you see, starting really with the famous book from Kahneman, right, and also very new word, Heald-Wolpert group, Heald-Lengyel-Wolpert, really cool work, and a little bit of my group maybe as well might be mentioned. So to summarize really what I wanted to say so far is that context is really like this umbrella thing that sets like the stage for local, distributed local planning, reasoning, and active inference-oriented probably processing, so motor control. And this motor control here, in this contextual frame, so if this box here is essentially the current contextual frame that I'm in, and then within that box there is a lot of stuff going on. There are events, there are event transitions, progressions of events that I'm considering, my behavior policy that unfolds and partially controls these events, how they unfold. This policy is influenced by my current goal, where do I want to get at right now. And the context also sets many conceptual lower level structures like spatial relations, distance to the bottle, for example, state of the bottle, if I want to drink out of it, if it's open or closed right now. All these things are relevant when I interact with the bottle. When I'm not interacting with the bottle, I communicate with you. It's not, right? There's other components, right? So it's the focus on particular schemes and concepts and so forth. And if you want to relate this to current AI jargon and machine learning, one might maybe say something and that the lower level stuff that I call concepts basically is somewhat like a domain-specific language that within the frame basically sets up a domain within which I want to talk or think about. On the higher level, within that frame, I unfold and probe chains of thought, right? I probe alternatives or just the mainstream of thought, how I interact with a particular environment. And, and these chains of thought are streamlined by habits. Imagine attention itself also is kind of a habit, right? Where do I find my toothbrush in the morning when I go into the bathroom? Well, it's a habitual look, and there it is, and I don't think about it, and I just proceed. Yeah? So it's streamlined by habits, not only the motor behavior, but also your mental attention, your endogenous attention. And then, and meanwhile, you try to maintain consistency. You try to maintain that everything is in agreement with each other. There is no interruption, no large surprises coming up while you interact with this world, our world. And that was the first part of my talk. If there are any immediate questions, I could answer them now. Maybe something, yeah, Marcel.
Do you think the inference of what context is currently relevant and the generation of behavior, do these happen sequentially, or is there like a world where I can imagine this happens at the same time?
I think it happens interactively, not sequentially and not back and forth. Yes, it must happen back and forth. Your actions, right, also continuously inform you if your task within a particular context unfolds as you wish, right? So if I try to open this bottle and suddenly I get stuck, right, I know I could do it more or less while I talk to you. But if there is like a problem with this lid, right, I would block, it would block my communication stream and would need me to focus more on that bottle context because otherwise I couldn't do it. Yes?
May I have one question, but if you think this is taking too long, maybe we'll do it at the end because I don't want to take time for your presentation. But I found it very interesting that, of course, context has to be a reduction of dominions or dynamics that allow you to be fast and to use a kind of categorization to react to faster in specific situations. But you also discuss about the flexibility part of it. So at the same time, you want to adapt to new situations. And if you end up choosing one new context or each new situation, then you don't have a solution of the framing because it's just the same.
Yes,
so how do you propose, I mean, your model, how do you propose this trade-off of flexibility, but then updating the context that do not work anymore?
Yeah, it's a very challenging question. I cannot answer it. It's a very important question to basically how to separate context. How do you know you're in the right context for the current problem at hand? I think this develops very emergently, and I don't like to think so much about context as like one symbolic thing that's just one thing there, basically. But I think context itself is extremely flexible and adaptable, basically, right? So if you fail in a particular task and you know that you succeeded, I think your curiosity, your ablative need basically to explain away why a particular thing failed pushes also towards the expansion of context and the adaptation of the contextual frame that you have really inferred before or activated before, right? But it's definitely, I mean, it's very difficult to say how this works exactly, right? But no.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. Maybe
Context and attention? Selective attention, yes, right, yeah.
Is it the case that context basically set out the stage for this?
Yeah, I would say so. Yes, that's perfect. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Sets the stage. Exactly. I mean, it's also a form of attention in a sense, right? So the selection of context is a form of attention. You could say so, but it's this higher level, the context inference, basically, or the activation of a particular context, right? Essentially narrows down your active selective attention to that frame, right, within which you maneuver your trains of thoughts, basically. Right? And that then overt, covert attention and so forth unfolds mainly within this frame, right? But if it realizes I'm stuck somehow and I don't find the solution, then there are mechanisms to also expand this frame and to reorient yourself, right? I should show the Necker cube actually still as a slide, which also is a nice way where you swap between two 3D interpretations, two 3D contexts, basically.
And would you then say they're both on the same level conscious, if you know?
Ooh, dangerous. That's also an important question. What's the consciousness then all about? I mean, in my opinion, the contextual inference is the higher level consciousness, if you allow me to say this, although that's very debatable and I don't have any, I mean, then what kind of consciousness are we talking about? I mean, I guess even like the high level frame that you're in and the readiness to process particular information over others, if you go to Alve Noe and stuff, that this might be even like something that links to phenomenal consciousness, basically. But then, of course, the frame within which you maneuver your thoughts and the perspectives that allows you to take it and so forth, this also might set the stage for particular levels of self-awareness and self-observing consciousness, basically. Yeah. Yes? Maybe last one, because
How do you think contexts are defined? For example, if you are transitioning from one context to another, sometimes there's kind of an intermediate context when you are switching, and maybe you can be in two kinds of contexts at the same time. For example,
you can, I mean, with the bottle and talking, I was more or less in two contexts, right? Right. Yes. It's There is, I mean, it's very difficult. It seems to be that, I would say the brain, how the brain does it, seems to be that there is like synchronizations. We are rate firing codes or so going on, really. Set contextual stages. If you have two contextual stages active in parallel, you need to have separate synchronizations. And that is really, really difficult, and then it falls apart if there is too many. So it's really hard to have numerous, and the more automatic and habitual an interaction with your environment is, as we all know, the more you have capacity to have another complex context active in your mind, right? But it seems very limited. There's a capacity limitation, and I think that capacity limitation comes also from boundedly rational behavior arguments and so forth, is probably this synchronization in your brain that's going on can only be going on via time-specific codes. And if there is synchronization over time, right, you can imagine that, I mean, you cannot have too many synchronizations active in parallel that don't interfere with each other, right? And then the more interference you have between those sub-contexts that you're currently in, the harder it will be to maintain them in parallel. All right, so and I'm going now first to the abstraction reasoning corpus challenge, because I love it, and my lab hates me for it. But not really, but I spent in the fall a little bit too much time programming it. But who has heard of the abstraction reasoning corpus challenge? Not so many people. Okay, so right. So this is a new $1 million challenge proposed originally in 2019 on the Measure of Intelligence paper by François Chollet, a very programming influential person and now like the protagonist of this challenge. Essentially, this was a $1 million prize. The current, last round ended on the 10th of November last year, and the goal was to the two best contributions. One didn't open their code, so the others were slightly above 50%. The challenge was to beat 85%. As a human being, if you see this challenge, these tasks, it takes a little while to get in, but you can solve nearly all of them. And so nobody solved it. Over Christmas then, O3 came out and they let it run, and it solved with the compute limit that was given for the challenge. It reached about 75%, I believe. And if they boosted the compute for each task to more than $2,000 of compute time, so the amount of energy is ridiculous, then it reached 85%. Yeah. But there's the new challenge. Arc version 2 is out now. So the deadline is again this November. And surprisingly, it didn't get much harder. Okay, sorry, this was bad animation. It didn't get much harder, but now O3 and all other systems that they have tested are below 5% of solving this task. And here I show you a few tasks. Like this one, for example, is relatively easy to solve mentally, right? So you see basically colored matrices. They can have 10 colors maximum, so 0 to 9, basically the numbers of each matrix entry. And this is the before-after situation, right? So you have this one before and this one after, or here before, after. And you see these two, and then you're supposed to solve this one. So here's a new one, solve the after situation, right? And who has no idea how to solve it? Yeah, you already all solved it, see? It's ridiculous. I mean, it's like, so no AI can solve this right now. Yeah? So why do I like this challenge, besides that it has much to do with context, is also because it has also much to do with cognition. I mean, how the heck is it that for us it seems to be like seemingly simple stuff, right? What's he showing us? Like, like I had colleagues and I was like, well, why are you showing us this stuff? It's totally simple. Yeah? And I was like, then apparently they hadn't listened. And I was like, well, yeah, but current AI cannot solve it at all. That's why it's interesting. Yeah? But the point is, right, why is it so seemingly simple to us? I think that is also an important question, right? Why is it simple to us and hard for AI? Well, and I think the answer is something like that we basically argue like this arc challenge kind of all the time. This is basically what's happening in our world, right? The goal of our world is typically to transition the before or the here and now to an after a goal. Yeah? We want to, in the end, to act goal-directedly. It's the imagination of a particular goal situation that we want to achieve. And we plan our way to achieve it. Yeah? The goal in the arc challenge is this image, the resulting image, basically. That's your goal. How do you create this goal, basically? And the start is the input image. Yeah? And here are examples of before-after situations in the real world. Imagine I would create a real-world arc challenge, basically. Right? A real-world arc challenge would be something that I would have a before, like a small group of people in front of a car, right? And after, those people sitting inside the car. Yeah? If I would show you two of these images, a small group in front and sitting after the car, could show you only two images or so, and I would show you another group of people in a very different contextual setting with a different car and so forth, and then I show you after options. And clearly, it's the people sitting in the car. That's the after image. I mean, that's so simple, right? And you can a couple of other examples, right? So you see, like this arc challenge is like is a everyday problem for us, basically. Of course, not in the matrix setting and with these concepts that are there in the matrix, but we can project it to our everyday life situations more or less seamlessly. So that's why I find this extremely fascinating. And now I only have a few minutes left, so I can only give you. But my goal was, I hope that you enjoyed this. My goal was really to give you the big picture of what we mean with context and what's all relevant there. Talk to Max more about his work on contextualizing decision-making processes. And basically, here we have a contextual level that does via active inference. Talk to Zara, who's going to give the tutorial afterwards about how this contextual inference works. Basically, in the end, the context sets the frame, essentially sets priors on your stimulus-response mappings, on your task, basically stimulus-response outcome. So that's the world model. This is your habitual behaviors. This is your stimulus expectations. And this is your goal. And it basically sets these priors over these graphical models of what's currently at stake. The graphical model, so to say, is the frame within which current thoughts unfold. And then the graphical model gives you density functions, and then the inference process uses those density functions to come to goal-directed decisions. And that's what unfolds. You can formalize this in fun equations that look scary to some of you, not so scary to others, but don't get scared away by them. In the end, they are really just quantifying the current error that's unfolding, the cost of changing, of doing mental effort to come to decisions, and then the adaptation of this. And this is basically your goal. This is your mental cost, and this is your higher level mental cost of doing context adaptation. And these three together, we argue, are main components of your inference processes that unfold to infer context and to make decisions within context. And you can do sampling by this and then do like fun Stroop task models that basically, or the task switching models and so forth, that where we show, Max has super nicely shown that basically you save energy when you have context and there's some sufficient regularity in the world, and only with a context, so only with that yellowish orange bar, you get the same behavioral patterns that you see in human behavioral data. So context, we argue, develops because you save mental effort to solve tasks, and because you save mental effort to solve tasks and thus have contextual representations in your mind, and that has evolved over millions and whatever years, you show this typical human-like behavior. Right, so this you can project this also in the inference of dialogues. And Asa is going to be here and give a workshop on Wednesday. So we have built a model here that basically, let me show you this one, if you have like tasks like this. So Adam wants to discuss election results with Jeff. And Adam feels about the issue. And here Adam thinks this is how Jeff feels about it, but here he's not sure. So he is very positive about it. The other one is negative about it. Adam wants to share his opinion, and wants to be honest about it. Or here we also write, wants to be nice about it, or wants to avoid conflict with the other person. So if he wants to be honest about it, right, he probably says the election results are amazing. If he wants to avoid conflict with the other person, maybe he says more something like, interesting election results, right? So to avoid conflict, right? And then basically in that same situation, right, you can imagine now to infer what does the person actually truly think if you believe that he or she also considers like avoiding conflict to a certain extent, right? So to choosing indirect speeches. So for example, Mary and Rachel meet a mutual friend's birthday party. They would like to exchange opinions but don't want to run into conflict. So Mary says the election results are poor, and Rachel replies, I find them interesting, right? And so basically, who thinks that Rachel also thinks the election results are not cool, right? And who thinks Rachel is more in favor of the election results? right? And who thinks Rachel is also ambiguous? Yeah, maybe also, right? But you see, right, it's this tendency you see, you can read out of this that probably it's more in favor. And we have modeled this with an inference model, basically, that, that takes now the context of a conversation, right? Now you have a context of a conversation, you have the opinion, the own opinion, and the other person's opinion, and this other person also has her own opinion, the other person's opinion, and you still have to take your opinion, what the other person believes you believe. That's enough, and then you can do exactly that inference that we have just like played through mentally. And that's just Bayesian inference. Again, it's just more or less the same that you do in a simple decision-making process, and then you model the human behavior. I wanted to show still a tiny bit, but I cannot. So we are also doing like fun stuff like this. This is a deep learning neural network model that basically taps attention-wise into this image because it's in the task of tracking the cat. And so it doesn't look at the whole image, but it basically just looks locally to track things. And I think this is a really important part. If you're in a context, you need to distribute your information gathering activities and the information that you need to change, need to gather from the environment task-orientedly in that local context. That's essentially attention. And you need to segment this stuff over time, which we also have done some work on with like some robot arms that roam around and imagine if it will open or close the door after all. That's why it wiggles back and forth here, for example. But I will not show this in further detail because I have to come to an end. And so I wanted to show you today that essentially context alleviates cognitive effort. And that's why context is there, and it focuses our mind and allows us to interact with the world flexibly and highly adaptively thus. The ArcAGI challenge also really requires context inference, and current deep learning systems cannot do it. And this context can be on a local decision-making component, but also on the social context level component 2 and 3 should be there actually. And then the slots and penalizing fluctuations is essentially how you can segment stuff and to put into context, but I couldn't show you this in much detail. Overall, though, I need to say, and that's why we're all here for this workshop, right? Fully contextual codings are still to be accomplished. It's totally unclear, and there are tons of challenges here. The learning challenge, how you learn, how you separate context also, and so forth. How you infer then the current context properly and fast and sufficiently well that you don't trap into problems all the time, fall into problems all the time. And this context is somewhat this distribution of actual context encoding, right, of objects, concepts, events, goals, frames of reference, and how this works and how this hangs together is clearly an open question, and contextual templates to develop them as well. And so I hope this was a lot of food for thought for the rest of these 2 days or 3 days, and that's it. Thank you for the attention.